This is Healthcare's Missing Logic podcast, episode number 147. Today, our special guest is Joel Brown. Joel is a respiratory therapist, a community and national leader, and an entrepreneur. He's a man after our own heart. Don't miss this one. Welcome back to Healthcare's Missing Logic podcast. This is the only podcast that shows you how to leverage polarity intelligence, an essential competency for healthcare leaders, and the missing logic in healthcare, so you can create healthy, healing organizations and become a thriving, resilient, and unstoppable healthcare leader.
We are your hosts, Tracy Christofferson and Michelle Trosett. We've been best friends and colleagues for over 30 years. And during that time, we coached healthcare leaders across North America around how to create healthy, healing organizations.
Today, we coach healthcare leaders and leadership teams to live thriving, resilient, and balanced lives, combat burnout, and create the best places to give and receive care.
This podcast is for the unsung hero of healthcare, the healthcare leader. We want you to know we see you and we'll be here for you each week. In this podcast, we're going to challenge healthcare's industry norms, flip limiting beliefs, and share proven strategies so you can be your best self at work and at home, live and lead intentionally, and experience well-being and joy.
We are glad you are here and look forward to sharing the journey with you. If you aren't totally convinced this podcast is for you, just listen to a few episodes and convince yourself. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Healthcare's Missing Logic podcast. And I'm here today with my best friend and respiratory therapist sidekick, Tracy Christofferson.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another incredible episode here on Healthcare's Missing Logic podcast. We're at your remote, not together. We're doing the vibes from across the country.
That's right.
That's
right.
That's why things look a little different if you're watching us on YouTube. But we had a really wonderful episode today and kind of warmed my heart to have another respiratory therapist on the podcast with us today. It was really a great interview.
Yeah, it really was. And as a nurse, I have always loved respiratory therapists, and Joel is just phenomenal. And you're going to love his story. There's a lot of different elements to his story that we're eager to share with you today.
Yeah, he's got lots of stories.
Yeah, he does.
Lots of stories and lots of wisdom and just lots of insights that I think you'll learn from, no matter what profession you're in. Just so happens that he's a respiratory therapist, so near and dear to our hearts.
Yes.
So I'm going to introduce you to Joel, and then we'll have you listen to this incredible interview. So Joel Brown is the CEO and founder of Arrived Leadership, LLC. His career has a proven track record of developing high potential leaders and creating high performing teams and functions. He's recognized internationally for his clinical and leadership lectures, research, and publications. After 30 years of healthcare and military experience, he was inspired to create a coaching, development, and consulting organization focused on a servant leadership philosophy. Before starting Arrived Leadership, he served as the Vice President of Operations for the medical group for the Christiana Care Health System. Before that, he served as the Senior Director of Patient Care at Nemours, and he received a baccalaureate degree in Biology and Respiratory Care from Millersville University, a Master of Science in Management from Wilmington University, and his Lean Six Sigma certification from the University of Delaware. Wow, Joel. Currently, Joel is the president of the Executive Board for Delaware Guidance Services, Vice President of the Board for Leadership Delaware Incorporated, Chair-elect for the Leadership and Management section of the American Association of Respiratory Care, and a member of Delaware State Society of Respiratory Care. In addition, he is actively involved in a scholarship fund that he and his wife developed for underrepresented young adults attending college. Joel is a fellow for the American Association of Respiratory Care and was previously awarded the DSRC's Senator Blevins Award. He is the former chair of the Delaware Department of Professional Regulations, Respiratory Care Practice Council, and former advisory board member for several state and community colleges in their respiratory care programs. In addition to his civilian accomplishments, he served and was honorably discharged from the United States Army Reserves as a medic. Quite the leader, Joel is, and you're going to love this interview with him. So without further ado, here's our interview with Joel. Wow, Joel, you just have no idea how excited we are to have a respiratory therapist on our podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm a big fan of the podcast and didn't realize I was the first respiratory therapist on.
Other than me.
Other than Tracy.
I've been holding up for a while here, right? So I'm just happy to have one of my peeps on with me.
Yes.
You have no idea, Joel, how excited she is for this.
I'm very excited. Super excited. Yeah. So why don't we just start with you kind of giving our listeners the scoop on your journey into respiratory therapy?
Oh, wow. So, yes, I'll start off first. I'm Joel Brown. I'm the CEO and founder of Arrive Leadership. Right now, I provide executive coaching. I do healthcare consulting and lecture series, speaking engagements. But respiratory care, first love, but was not my first role within healthcare. I started off as in the military as a medic, and actually never even knew what a respiratory therapist was until I went into the Army. Once I went to the Army, this was during Desert Storm time, 1990. And for those trying to figure out my age, I was 2 years old at that moment in 90. But I was in the Army, and they were trying to get people to go full time. And so they were showing them other fields that they could offer within the Army through training. And they told me about this thing called respiratory therapy. I was like, man, let me give that a try. That sounds kind of cool. And I had the best person show me around, and he was super engaged, showed me everything, and I was bit by the bug from that moment on. The thing is I decided that instead of going full time in the Army, which is what that would have required, I was a reservist at the time, I decided to do it on my own. And from there, I mean, that was from that point to when I graduated was 8 years. 8 years of working. I worked the 2 jobs and went to school full time. I was really dedicated to it, and I've loved the field ever since. Do not regret a moment of it, and that's why I'm still actively involved. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. What a great
awesome
story. Yeah. I love hearing how people get introduced to respiratory therapy because it's not something like you grow up wanting to do, like it's not, like nurses. Oh, I always knew I wanted to be a nurse.
Yeah.
It's very hard to find somebody who says, I always knew I wanted to be a respiratory therapist.
Yeah. I haven't bumped into too many 5-year-olds where I said, hey, what do you want to be? And they go, I'm a respiratory therapist.
Like, that's so funny.
Exactly.
So we all we all have like a unique story behind how we got there. And then, whether it's through family, through a connection, through me, through the military, someone introducing me something that to me was unique. And I felt like add a lot of value, not only to our patients, but to how I felt as someone who loves to take care of people and loves to see people do better. So, yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Well, I got exposed to it up close and personal when a very, very dear friend of mine was in a terrible car accident.
Okay.
Was intubated on a ventilator for months, comatose. So I watched day after day how they cared for her, and that's how I got introduced to it. So actually, everybody has a different story.
The one part I left out in that story, which I think was the part that really hit me the most, is when this, it was one of the sergeants. I don't have permission to put his name out there, so I won't do that. But he knows who he is. I'd never forget, we were in a burn unit at the Brooke Army Medical Center, and there was a trach patient there, and she was struggling. And they were like, go get him, because he had the best connection with this patient. So anytime when she would have difficulty or didn't want to, comply, they would go get him. And here is this field of this guy's in a field I've never heard of, and he has the best connection with this patient. And it was because he had been with her since the beginning. From when she first came to the ICU to rehab, he had constantly taken care of her. And I was like, wow, that's really unique that he followed her through the continuum of care. And that was part of that connection.
That's awesome. Well, as a critical care nurse, didn't take me long to realize that respiratory therapists were my besties. A lot of collaboration at the bedside.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Well, Joel, as you know, we've been really working with healthcare leaders to combat burnout since the beginning of COVID-19. And we know how critical respiratory therapists have been, in this whole pandemic, right? And just the collaboration that's occurred and their expertise that they've brought to the patients and to their other team members. And so we just wondered, what have you learned or seen regarding burnout in respiratory therapy? Because it's really rampant. And we hear a lot about it when it comes to nurses and physicians, but just kind of what's your take on that for respiratory therapy?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the one thing that I definitely was able to learn through this is that, as a respiratory therapist, you may, for example, Michelle, you were saying you're an ICU nurse, right? So there may be one respiratory therapist in that space. They could have 8 ventilators, patient die.
Yeah.
And the expectation for us is within 15 minutes to go right back to work because we have 7 other ventilated patients to manage. And that patient codes, and the expectation is to go right to it. So I think that because of that almost resilience, it was part of our job. It has been underestimated through COVID, like that respiratory therapist struggle. I'll tell you a quick story which happened to me that leans to the expectation of resilience, even though it may not be real. It may be just kind of subdued, perceived, and you're just pushing down those emotions. I remember I had a very sick patient. I started off in pediatrics, and it just the story connected to me. And the patient passed. There was a dad. The kid was my age. The dad was my age. It was a little girl. Very accidental situation, and the patient died. We had to take the patient for harvesting for organ donor. So you have to take the family in the OR to pull the tube. And we came back, and one of my supervisors said, "All right, go to the bathroom, get yourself together. We got to get back to work." Right? And I remember being young, I was, new therapist. I went in the bathroom. I didn't know why I was in the bathroom, but I went because I was told. I was an ex-military guy. I followed instruction. And I came back out, and I was still disturbed, right? But the perception was that that's the way we need to do things. So what I think we've learned during COVID, right? Because there are things that happen initially, and then, it might be a while before you have another. It's this long, drawn out repeat of the same thing. And so what we've learned is just that respiratory therapists not only need the support, but probably need it more than many others, because of how many patients we take care of. And in addition to that, because of how this disease impacted the lungs. So we saw a lot of them. So I think that's important. And then the other part, it identified a gap for leadership, a gap for organizations. Like, how much training did we receive? Here, I'll put it in mine. How much training did I receive about how to manage resilience in my undergrad when I received my bachelor's in biology and respiratory therapy? 0. How much did I even receive in my master's degree? Part of one class. And that was more about how to deal with me versus how to deal with staff. So I think we've identified those gaps and realized that we need to, educate not only our managers and our supervisors and our people leaders, but also educate staff of when to. I have a lecture called when to throw in the towel, and taking that off as being a negative thing, right? You see throwing the towel, you see the guy who's boxing and they throw in the towel because he's getting beat up. But sometimes throwing in the towel is saying, "Hey, that's enough for now. We have some things to work on. And guess what? We're coming back and we're going to fight you again." So I always use the Rocky example, when they screamed into throwing the towel, because he came back, and actually in the first one, most people don't realize he did not win the first one. It was after he came. It was the next movie that he won. So like being comfortable with throwing in the towel, not just for ourselves, but also for each other.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's such a huge point, right? And yet you feel, there's just a lot of, if it comes to burnout or experiencing there's a lot of stigma, right? If you throw in the towel, right? That you're not strong enough, that you can't handle it. But I think it's really about recognizing there are times where it's essential, right? For your own mental health and well-being to say, I can't take any more. And then for our leadership teams to figure out, how can we support this so people have that as an option, right? That we
Yes.
build it in. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
That's
so,
so important.
it's funny because as you said that, it remind me that I'm thinking of changing that title is when to tap out, because tapping out. So I have a background in martial arts, and so when you're doing like any kind of work on the ground, right? I know that if someone has my arm at a certain angle, I could be hurt, so I tap out, right? Because that comes from one is someone witnessing you being beat, throwing a towel, right? The other is I am aware that I'm at the point where I could be hurt, so I'm going to tap out so we can reset, and I can come back and try it again, and then maybe do it a little different. But yeah, it's the self recognition on top of that. So I actually thought of changing the title of that lecture, and now after just saying that, I'm pretty sure I will.
Yeah. Well, and as somebody who's served, right? Like, I think a lot of times when we think about the pandemic and about the impact on the individuals, they weren't prepared.
Yeah.
Right. It's not like when you go into service and you're prepared for battle, you're prepared for what you're going to see. You're prepared in a lot of different ways, mentally, emotionally, physically, right? To deal with the stress and strain. And healthcare clinicians were not, right? So is there any insights that you have in regards to, what a respiratory therapist need now, like in addition to knowing they can tap out? And is there any other, education, any other kinds of supports that would be really, really important?
Yeah. One thing that the pandemic has kind of forced many organizations to accept is the need for respiratory therapist-driven protocols, right? When you have this large volume when you only have your normal census, even if your normal census is high, then it could be very physician-driven care. But when you're at the point where you're at the end, and I can tell you, my last role was the vice president of acute medicine for the medical group. So I covered the hospitalists, the ICU physicians, radiologists, pathologists. I covered those groups. And we were thin with numbers of physicians. And if you can get your therapist-driven protocols written up and get them together, number one, that relieves a lot of the work from the physician. Number two, it relieves a whole lot of the work of the therapist trying to chase someone down in a critical situation just to get an order on something that they know is the right thing to do. And then the last thing, it helps decrease workload. If I'm able to move patients and get them to where they need to be faster, that means I'm not providing care that isn't going to have a direct impact on my patients. So from a leadership standpoint, right? Leaders have to pause and go, okay, all those barriers that were perceived barriers for not having therapist-driven protocols, we got to just get rid of those. The excuses because so-and-so doesn't want to do it, or because this administrator doesn't agree with it. It's not only became a safety issue, it became a financial issue. Equipment wasn't available, right? So if we're running out of a certain device, and I could have moved that patient off of it per protocol. Now we're trying to figure out algorithms to get other equipment in because they're sitting on it. So I think the folks that had therapist-driven protocols were probably slightly more prepared than folks that did not.
Yeah. Well, and the protocols really just enable you to live to your fullest scope of practice.
Yes.
Yep.
Right. And to make the decisions for patient care that are in alignment with your license, alignment with your scope. And to do that and, with guidance, because there are clearly written guides as to how you can act within those, just for our listeners that may not be familiar. So when you have those things in place, then you can just act and you can just do what you need to do, and you don't get bogged down, to your point, right?
Which
with
helps,
trying to work through the red tape and,
And it helps when you start talking about resilience, right? One of the ways to persevere is when you have full pride in what you're doing, right? If I feel like I'm here, I'm fully able to do everything that I was trained to do, I feel valued. That's one of them. I mean, there's many tools that are needed, but that's one of them. You give someone who's unhappy with what they're doing, and then you give them a lot of it at a high stress level. Yeah, it's hard to persevere through that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. What about the leaders?
Yeah.
Joel, what have you noticed about the lead? Because what we knew early on was that, there was a lot of support for clinicians and all clinicians, and rightfully so. But what we saw, there wasn't a lot for the leaders. And that's why we stepped in to offer what we've been offering, is to really support the leaders. But so, Joel, from your perspective, what have you noticed with the leaders and respiratory care and the impact of COVID and the pandemic on them?
Yeah. What's unique about respiratory, right? So when you're thinking about nursing, right? And you think about a hospital, especially the size of the one I was working for, we had, 1,000-bed hospital, one 250, and the other was 150. Well, within there's probably about 50, 60 nurse managers, right? There's one director of respiratory, 2 managers, right? So I think, what we've learned in respiratory is how much more dependent we had to become with our nursing colleagues, number one, and other respiratory managers within the organization. Because when you're in those stressful situations and you're dealing with something that you've not been exposed to, having someone that can say, hey, this is what I've done is important, right? So the siloing that can occur, and especially in the field of respiratory care, has to come down. We've learned, and actually a lot of the progress we had has been from collaborating with other departments, right? And I mean, here I am at I've actually was the director in the beginning of the pandemic, and then I was a vice president of the medical group in the other. And both of them, I found myself still utilizing information and learning from what respiratory is doing, nursing's doing, and vice versa. So the one thing that is that silo and that loneliness that a respiratory manager could feel. I remember, working at another organization, which a much smaller hospital, and there was one respiratory manager. So they didn't have a lot of resources that they could reach out to get other respiratory specific information. So this is where your national organizations come in and help out a lot. The other thing is, right now, what we're really dealing with is staffing. I think everyone's heard this, right?
Yeah.
The impact of COVID has staffing-wise for respiratory therapists. I mean, number one, you have this volume going way up where you need more RTs, and you have people who are burnt out and resigning or going to travel jobs. And so I think the travel industry in the respiratory care field has never been that large, but now it is. And we're going to have to learn how to adapt to that. I think if we sit here and think that, everyone's going to come back to work full time, that might be a little naive. So I think that a lot of people will, but not all. I think that world is going to be part of our new reality, and we're going to have to figure out how to work with it and along with it as we go forward. Of course, I'm a little old school, so my heart is to have the employee work for me. But the reality of it is that might not be what you will see in the future. So we have to figure out how to adapt to that. So there's been so many gaps that are available, but I think even as tragic as the COVID has been, I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to learn and grow from the experience here. And I use this scenario, back in the day, and we still do, right? You had code blues. We would go to Code Blues, and each time there was something tragic to happen, we would sit there and we would debrief, and we'd learn something from it. And one of the things we learned was that, not every one of these are unpreventable. And that's when RRTs came, rapid response teams, right?
Yeah.
So I think we've had our Code Blue. Now let's figure out what the rapid response team part of it is. How do we make sure that we prevent them more than wait until they happen?
Right. That's a great point. And I agree with you. I think there's a big shift towards traveling, and there's obvious benefits to that, right? Financial, but I think also we'll see another, I agree with you. I think we'll see a shift. Some of those will come back because they'll long for the connection, for the belonging to an organization, to the things that being a part of an organization gives you.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think I think it'll balance out over time. But you're right. It's prevalent across the professions when it comes to staffing and the challenges and the changes that have occurred because of COVID.
Yeah.
And that's one of the big polarities that we teach about is recruitment and retention.
Yeah.
And when you have strong programs on both sides, it makes it a lot easier to maintain, really optimal staff, right?
Yeah.
And it's becoming
services.
more I mean, when I was a director, I was the first at the children's hospital I was with. I was the first director to hire a traveler. And I started there in 2015. So it was probably 2016, 2017. I hired a traveler there and they had a staff of 80 plus. Now they have several, right? So it just shows you how
Yeah.
things are shifting. And it was starting before COVID, but COVID put an
Mm-hmm.
emphasis on it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. And I think to your point is there are a lot of opportunities because of COVID, and we have to be learning from them. So I just really appreciate you saying that. Like, don't miss it, right? Don't miss the lessons. Don't miss the learning of how we need to really change and shape into a new future. So really great point. Well, obviously from your introduction, you are a leader, Joel. So would you mind telling our listeners how you stepped into the leadership role and maybe some of your lessons along the way?
Yeah. I think just like everybody else, you end up in leadership by absolute accident. That's another one, somebody taps you on the shoulder. What do you want to be when you're 5? A leader. Oh, what's that even mean? Right. No, in my time as a respiratory therapist, I never skipped a role. I worked every role. I was a staff therapist, charge therapist. I did research. I was a clinical specialist. I was an educator, manager, director, senior director before I became a VP. And I think that path was me trying to figure out where I wanted to be. I kind of look at it as I knew all the roles that were available and I was getting a taste of each one and figuring out which one really hit my heart. And it was when I became an educator, I realized that it was the leadership side. And it was for 2 reasons. Number one, as I was working, I loved being a clinician and I really loved it. And then eventually it started feeling a little repetitive. And also I felt like I was limited to how many people I could touch because I wanted to be able to like see and have some part of everything. And it was probably at that point when I was a clinical specialist, I started having students and have new employees. And I started feeling this pride of seeing a student or a new employee that I worked with do really, really well. And in the background, know that I had something to do with that. Probably more than like if someone came to me and said, Joel, you did a great job, I'd go, oh, they're just saying that. But if they said, man, did you see so and so? And I knew in the back of my mind, I oriented them or taught them how to do it. Oh, it was the best feeling in the world. And so that's when I became an educator and I started doing it more. And I started realizing like I like it, but it was limited. I would see them when they were in orientation, then they would leave. And then I couldn't continue to be part of them unless they really, really connected with me. And that's when I went into the manager role and I just loved it. I loved every moment of it. I loved watching people grow, watching them become better leaders. I love the fact that it wasn't as concrete as the clinical. I mean, although the clinical world is always evidence-based medicine, right? Leadership, your path is continuous. Thus, when you see the name of my business, Arrive Leadership, it's called that because I believe you arrived when you realize that the journey is continuous. When you think that's when you arrive. If you find someone who's like, oh, I'm there as a leader. I know everything I need to know. They have not arrived. You arrive when you realize like you're at your infancy. You're a neophyte when it comes to that, and it's going to go on till the day you die. And so each time I just kept getting these roles and the more people that I could have an impact on, the better I felt about it. And to this day, my most proud accomplishment is that every role that I left as I got promoted was filled by someone I mentored.
Oh.
Yeah, that's
like
cool.
Everyone. So when I was an educator, it was filled by someone I mentored. When I became a manager, it was filled by someone I mentored. I became a director, it was filled by somebody I mentored. And now I'm a VP and they're still trying to fill it out. But I know that there's some folks that I mentored that are going to be applying and will be the most appropriate person for. So that just fills me with, I mean, you have finance, you have all the things, but then it's like, what makes you wake up in the morning? And what makes me wake up in the morning is seeing people do well. And then maybe I just had a little bit to do with it. And I can be in the background, quiet, and just watch them do well.
Yeah.
Wow,
That's
what
awesome.
what a legacy.
Yeah. You were doing succession planning.
I know.
Oh yeah. Big. I love that. I love that. So, it's interesting you mentioned that, right? So now I'm doing executive coaching And, I have my own business. And, I went to my team and I said, all right, these 6 people are folks that I've been mentoring forever. And I know it's a business now, but they will be working with me for free because I'm doing this business because it's what I love. And since it's what I love, I want to continue to connect with the people that I've already connected with. So, it really excites me. It's what drives me.
Right.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, we understand that you also did a TEDx talk.
Yeah.
So we were hoping you could tell our listeners a little bit about that experience and what you talked about.
Yeah. So the TEDx talk experience is very interesting. So I actually was doing a lecture so I'm the vice chair of a group called Leadership Delaware. I've actually went through this program. It's an advanced leadership program. It's really great. It kind of focuses on Delaware. It was started by Governor Pete DuPont and Terry Strine. And, it's a great program. So I went there to do a lecture, and it was my What's Next for You lecture. And this is a 1-hour lecture that talks about from soup to nuts, a little bit about me, about my background growing up in West Philly, to like the military. And then like, how did I get here from a kid growing up in a pretty rough neighborhood in Philadelphia? Well, that's connected with Leadership Delaware was also connected with TED Talks, saw my lecture, and reached out to them. And then they reached out to me saying, hey, we want you to do a TED Talk. I was like, great. Which one? What's next for you? Oh, I love that one. And they're like, by the way, it should be between 8 to 18 minutes. What? It's a 1-hour lecture. How do I do this? But that experience of that, was interesting, taking something that's a philosophy of yours and moving it down to just being, it ended up being 12 minutes. So for those who've never done TED Talks, it's a one shot. There's no editing. And I don't write down my lectures. I don't have scripts. I usually, memorize the majority of it and then kind of go with it. So that part, it went well. I enjoyed the experience, but man, it's probably one of the scariest moments of my career. What the lecture is about is, what's next for you is about like setting goals and then figuring out how to achieve them. And often when people hear what's next for you, they think you're talking about where do you want to be at the end point, right? And in my mind, if you only focus on the end point, there's so many steps that are in between there and you can lose your steam. So what's next for you is truly what's the next step you need to do to get there. So you can get there, you can celebrate it, you can, pat yourself on the back, take a deep breath, and then find the next part. So I use the example of building a castle out of building blocks or Legos. And the example is that when you look at the picture on there and you see what you want, you go, this is great. And you open it up and it's 1,000,000 pieces. And sometimes seeing those 1,000,000 pieces to your career are the things you have to do. I got to get a degree. I need experience here. Then I need another degree. And right? That could get frustrating. But the first thing you do is you look for the instructions in the box, which will tell you how to do it. And that's, if you want to do something, you want to be a COO, I often use like a LinkedIn and I'll go and find COOs resumes and it'll tell you exactly or find a job that they're searching. It'll tell you what you need to be there. Then I talk about the next step after that is that you need a mentor. When you're a kid and you open up that box and you're frustrated and there's so many pieces, having a friend or a parent that can give you a hand to help you figure it out is important. So same thing for your career. You need mentors to show you how to get there. And then the last part of it is it's not going to put itself together by itself. You have to do the work. So you have to get there, roll up your sleeves, do the work. And then the last part of it, which I think is the most important part, you'll finish it. And guess what? You may say, you know what, I want more. That doesn't mean you have to knock down the entire building block. You can use those same blocks to build another castle. So that's why I talk about with my career going from a medic to being a respiratory to being a operational VP in the medical group. I used the same pieces. I didn't throw away the pieces from my castles from before. So that's the short version of my What's Next for You lecture.
There you go. In less than 5 minutes.
Yes.
See, you're getting better and better at this all along, Joel.
I love it. I love it. Such a great analogy. Thank you for sharing that. That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, it's the experiences, right?
Yes.
That you have along the way. So you can always leverage the experiences that you've had in whatever the next step is for you, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So anyway, we understand that congratulations is in order, that you have just accepted entrance into a PhD program. And so we wondered, how is this going to support what's next for you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I know many of you are out there thinking, what is he thinking? Because it is not an easy path. Yeah. And it's funny because I'm at the point in my career now. I started my new business because I'm in what some would call like a semi-retirement. So I started my own business, and my business is just doing the things that I love, which is also part of an arrivement, is what we call it, is that you start focusing on just doing the things you love. And if you just happen to get paid for it, then that can't get better. But I've always wanted to get to have a PhD, to max out have a terminal degree, even though I know that learning continues. And so it's for multiple reasons. I may have not said it in this, podcast, but I grew up in a really rough neighborhood, humble beginnings. They called my neighborhood the bottom for multiple reasons. When you watch the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and he says, West Philadelphia, born and raised, he grew up in the same neighborhood. My sister went to the same high school. So his story was very relatable, except there was no LA options for me. So he still stay there. But, I recognize that, being an example is super important, especially in my community. Like, I see someone who looks like me or comes from my neighborhood that can do that. And then, even though that may not be the only reason why you do it, it does give you a nice boost. I know I can because he did. Mm-hmm. And if folks meet me and know me, like, there's nothing that special. I'm not a genius, but I work hard. So that's the first one part. It's just, I think, good for the community. For my own personal, it's something I always wanted to do. I've had hurdles in the way, barriers in the way, that when I did my planning, I said, that's something I'll do when I get to this point. And now I'm here. It is truly my what's next. And then last, I really want to learn a little bit more. I am published. I've been published several times, but I want to learn more about how to do that. I want to try to, my PhD is going to be in organizational leadership. And a lot of the things we talked about earlier that have to do with COVID and gaps in leadership training and development, I want to kind of dive into that a little bit more. And then last but not least, I'm going to a HBCU. For those who don't know what that means, it's a historically Black college or university. There's a handful of them within the country. So I've always wanted to go to an HBCU and get that experience, to have the traditional education combined with the cultural part of being at a predominantly Black school. So I'll be going to University of Maryland, Eastern Shore, for their organizational development PhD program. So pray for me is what I'm saying. It's a lot of work.
Well, yeah, I know. I'm just finishing mine. So I'm with you. I'll be holding the torch for you and cheering you on. Let me tell you, it is a journey like none other.
Yeah. So really what you're saying, Joel, is when Tracy finishes, I can take her off my prayer list and put you on it.
Please write my name twice.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have no doubt you'll be successful. No doubt.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we also know that you are the new chair of the Leadership and Management section of the American Association of Respiratory Therapists. And so tell us what you're most excited about that.
Yeah. So, I'm the chair-elect of the American Association for Respiratory Care, the AARC. I have been a member, and I'm not here representing the AARC. I'm here representing Arrive Leadership, but I'm proud of the assignment because it's a elected role. So my colleagues chose me for this role, and it's a honor to be able to serve other respiratory care professionals. And the AARC is not just respiratory therapists; it's respiratory therapists, right? Like, I'm proud of that. So there's some pride around being a respiratory therapist. But we also have uh, nurses and physicians that are active members. So right now, I'm the chair elect, so I'm a non-voting member, but I am looking forward to
Okay.
engaging with other respiratory leaders. I'm looking forward to identifying gaps within our field that we can, provide education. I'm looking forward to learning from our more senior and seasoned and the wisdom that's available by connecting with folks at that level. I'm looking forward to that, and more importantly, I'm looking to serve the community of respiratory care, respiratory therapists that are, it's an international organization. So I've been actively involved, but I'm looking forward to taking that next step. And by going into my arrivement or semi-retirement, it affords me the time to be able to do it, because I really don't like doing anything halfway. So I'm looking forward to going full board and helping. Yeah.
That's awesome.
It is.
Well, congratulations on that
Yeah.
too.
And gosh, what a gift to the association. So that's awesome.
Yeah. The one thing that I will say is that and I'm pretty hoping that many RTs will be listening into this podcast. That is, if you're listening and you hear my voice and you're not a member, I highly recommend you become a member. And I'm speaking on the behalf of Joel Brown. I can tell you that connection to a national organization, for me, and I still say this, it charges my battery. When I get to go to a national conference or get to be around other, thought leaders, it will recharge your battery. It'll do what I call connect to purpose. There's two connect to purpose. There's the one around our clinical one, and there's a professional one. Our clinical connect to purpose we see every time when we walk out our offices and walk around our patients. I always use the example. I remember one time sitting there and I was really struggling with the budget. And then I walked out and I saw this kid pushing an IV pole with a shaved head that looked at me with a big smile on her face and said, "Good morning." And I was like, man, what am I complaining about this budget for, this kid, right? That's a clinical connected purpose. But then there's it's like, get you, like, really, like that budget is not the worst thing that ever happened to you. And then the professional connected purpose is when you get to engage with other leaders, like this for me today, like this fills my tank. It's a battery recharge. And so connect with your professional organizations, and I highly recommend the AARC.
Yeah.
That's great.
And I think the other thing that we're noticing now too, that COVID is lighting up a little bit, is conferences are coming back together. People are reconnecting, and for some people, they don't realize how much they miss that, right? It's just really powerful.
Yeah.
So totally get the connection piece there.
Yeah, we've been in
Joel,
a role.
it's time for the missing.
Go ahead. I'm looking forward to this part.
Are you?
Yes.
You looking forward to our missing questions?
Yes, I am.
Okay. All right. Well, here's the first one. What is your favorite sport and why?
Football. Oh, well, I guess favorite sport to watch or perform, right? So it could be two. I'll do football for his favorite
Answer
sport.
both.
Football's favorite sport to watch. I'm a huge Philadelphia Eagles fan. I love watching the Eagles. We were the underdog. We did win a Super Bowl eventually, but that underdog feel always, like, I love the teamwork. I love the way, especially as someone who's really into huddles and developing huddles. I use football analogies often, meaning that the football team huddles and everyone needs to know what the game plan is, even if you're not the one carrying the ball. So the person that's the center and the lineman, they're just as important to being in that huddle as the person who's the running back and the quarterback. So I love that type of teamwork where everyone has a different goal, even though their role is different. So that's why I love football. Then from other personal, I was always big into wrestling and martial arts, which are more like contact sports, because although it's a team, it's a challenge to you. to overcome, to persevere,
Right.
and to most of the martial arts I'm in are fairly, like they call them, gentle martial arts, which means you do protect yourself, but you can get someone to kind of submit before you have to really hurt them. So it's also knowing your capabilities and how you can, knowing your limits and building confidence in you that you don't have to engage. Meaning, if you're in a situation where someone really wants to, physically attack you, that you can, your confidence in knowing that you can protect yourself allows you not to engage. So if someone comes, hey, this is going to happen. Okay, that's fine, right? Because I don't need to prove anything. I have confidence and know that I can protect myself. So one is around teamwork. One is around just self-control and ability to, work with your alone by yourself, even though you're within, working amongst the team.
That's awesome.
That's an individual team polarity right there.
It is.
That's really a great analogy. I love it. All right, here's your second missing question, Joel. What has been the most influential book that you have read more than once?
Read more than once. Actually, the book on love languages. Yeah. My wife and I read it together. Not like, we'd go, all right, chapter 1 this week. So it helped my personal relationship, but it really, when you talk about leveraging separate realities, knowing how someone else wants to be connected with, that book is a great lesson in that. Like, so, if someone's love language is being, in their, around them, or their love language is gifts, right? It helped me realize it not only in your personal relationship, but as you're leading folks. Not everybody wants to be recognized the same way. Everyone has a different love language. Everyone has a different way they want to be recognized. And the more personal you can take how you can take the way you recognize folks, the better off you are. And then it also helped me not try to show love the way I want to see it, the way I want to receive it, right? So some people's gifts, and there's some people are doing things, some people may be, again, being around, and, you have to figure out that just because I like, recognition this way doesn't mean everyone does. So take your time, and figure out each individual, see what they want. It's one of the best exercises I ask my staff to do, which is every time they meet with their folks, ask them, how do they like to be recognized? And in a way, to me, that's their professional love language.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So now we're curious, what's yours?
I like to do things, service. So if I am showing love, I will do things for you. I will I'll put, like with my wife, like I'll go put things together that she wants, or she wants, a new this, I will go get it and put it together and do all the work. But what I learned was that hers is just spending time. So while I was showing my love language, I may have not been reflecting hers. So then I just had to figure out how to balance that. Yeah. So it's a great book, and it's not just from a personal side. I think there's a lot of a transition that can go into leadership. Except physical touch. Don't do that.
There's a lot of application. Yeah. Keep that one out. Yeah. There's a lot of applications.
Yeah.
A lot of applications for that book. Yeah. All right. Last question. Here we go, Joel. So, we teach polarity intelligence, and really just kind of how to think both and it's really just a principle about, polarities and how things are interdependent. And sometimes we have a preference for one pole more than the other. That's a natural occurring thing, right? Like you have a preference for service. I mean, that's just a preference that you have, right? Something you've developed over time. So I'm going to ask you about a specific polarity, and I want you to share what is your preference.
Okay.
So the polarity is optimism and realism.
Ooh.
Which do you prefer?
Man, I would probably say I am the optimist. Even though I recognize the reals, but I am the optimist. And I'll tell you why, right? My life is an example of optimism. If you I was raised by a single father. My mother passed when I was 5, right? I grew up in a rough neighborhood. I joined the military during wartime. And now I am a CEO of my own business. That is optimism. If I just looked at what was real and in front of me alone and really leaned into that, I can't say I would be able to overcome that. And then my faith requires me to be an optimist, as a Christian, right? That's an optimism faith, right? There's a reality that's in the Bible, but then there's the faith of what's coming soon. And so I think my life would show that I'm the optimist, but I do recognize the reality. But if I had to lean towards one, definitely the optimist. I can't tell you how many times that someone goes, I can't believe you're putting all that energy into so-and-so. And I'm like, no, I think they really, really can do it. And I just would rather be wrong.
Yeah.
Put the energy into the optimist side and be wrong and let the reality tell me I'm wrong later than just not do it. So, yeah. It's a great question. I love that question.
Well, that's a great example.
Yeah.
Well, it makes you pause a little bit, right? Well,
Yeah.
That's what I appreciate. It makes you pause and think. And the truth is, we often recognize both. It's not that you don't recognize the other side and the significance of it. It's just that you tend to kind of lean that way, right?
Yeah.
And it's just good to know that, because sometimes then you have blind spots on the other pole because it's not your preference, right? So you don't as readily recognize all the benefits of that pole as you might, or the other one that you tend to prefer.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's just
the interesting
the
thing
reality
is
of it.
the interesting thing is, even in a world of research, which is very reality based, right? Anytime I've done a paper or read a paper, most of the papers that I've written myself or that I've come up with the research idea was based off the optimism. Like I would hear about a study or see something we're doing, and I'm like, I bet we could do better than that, right? That's a researcher's mind.
Yeah.
So it's kind of based in reality,
sure.
but you got to have a lot of optimism to jump out and do a paper that you could probably spend 6 months to a year of your time and find out it's going to be nothing. It takes some optimism for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure it does.
That's awesome. Oh, what a great interview. Thank you so much, Joel, for sharing your stories and your expertise. And I just learned so much about just how leadership is, you don't have to even have it all figured out in the beginning, but I loved how the castle story and you just follow that path and keep it going. I can't wait to see where you're going to be 5 years from now.
Hopefully done the PhD program.
Yeah.
Hopefully done the PhD program. Yes.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Really. Thank you for being our first respiratory therapist on the show, and just to sharing, I think some insights around respiratory therapy and leaders in respiratory therapy and all the different avenues that you've taken. And, I just think it's heartwarming for me, for others, excuse me, to get some insight into leadership from a respiratory therapy perspective. And I just really appreciate you bringing that and all your lessons learned and wisdom. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite. I enjoy the podcast. I'm hoping that everyone out there listening, got to hear something that may be inspiring. And for those who are, respiratory therapists, nurses, physicians, anyone that's out there clinically, know that the community appreciates you, and we're all proud of each other. But definitely take a moment, pat yourself on the back, take a deep breath, because we've been through a lot. It's a once in every 100-year event that we're at the light at the end of the tunnel for.
Yes.
So I appreciate you all.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And for all of our listeners out there, this is a wrap for another awesome Healthcare is Missing Logic podcast, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you.
Yep. Stay healthy, stay safe.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Healthcare is Missing Logic podcast, now a top-rated podcast for healthcare leaders. Please share this podcast with other healthcare leaders and anyone else you think would benefit. We are certain that if you found value in it, they will too. If you haven't already done so, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any episodes. And also, it would mean the world to us if you took a quick moment to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast player. It helps to get the word out about our podcast and incredible guests. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want to watch our podcasts. You can also follow us on our Missing Logic social media channels, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Until next time.